Okinawa, June 1945. Heat, wire, and waiting. The sun beat down like a verdict. Heat shimmered off canvas and corrugated metal, turning each breath into a small labor. The prisoner of war compound was a grid of tents and razor wire, a temporary geometry imposed on a landscape that had already been burned by battle. Dust rose in thin ghosts whenever boots passed. A diesel generator hummed somewhere beyond the line of sight, an electric heartbeat for a place that had temporarily ceased to be ordinary life. Sergeant James Crawford made his patrol in the slow economy of a man used to carrying more than orders. At 27, he wore the war on his face, the faint white scar by his lip, the dark hollows beneath his eyes, the farmer's steadiness in his hands. He remembered his mother's line, "Never lose your humanity," not as comfortable advice, but as a stubborn standard tested every day in the Pacific's heat. Around him, the camp held people who had been citizens and neighbors a month before, and were now cataloged under numbers and intake forms: nurses, grocers, teachers, farmhands, ordinary lives rearranged by war. Supplies were thin. Interpreters were thin. The Geneva Conventions existed as doctrine and manuals, but in the field they had to compete with confusion, exhaustion, and a steady grinding scarcity. Mercy required space and time. Both were rationed.
A nurse in pain. Yuki Yamamoto. In the shade of a tent, huddled on a worn blanket, sat Yuki Yamamoto. She was 24, formerly a civilian nurse who had administered morphine and bandages in a field hospital before the lines shifted and the world she knew crumbled. Her kimono was soiled and torn. Her hair was cut ragged from months without a proper barber. Yet there was a professional precision in the way she shifted, in the way she clutched her abdomen. 2 days ago, a dull ache had started beneath her ribs. It had been easy to ignore. Another late night, another case of dysentery in the post-battle slurry of illness. But by morning, it had sharpened to a pain that took breath. Memories from nursing training surfaced. The way peritoneal pain localizes, the guarding that announces inflammation. She pressed a trembling hand to the lower right quadrant of her belly and tasted the metallic tang of fear. Appendicitis in a field without a sterile operating room was a brutal diagnosis. If a rupture came, septic peritonitis would follow: swelling, collapse, death. Yuki had seen it happen to men on both sides. She also knew this: without someone who recognized the signs and could act within hours, there would be no second chance. Language was a wall. Her English knowledge was a scatter of basic phrases. The guards had even less Japanese. How do you plead for a scalpel in a language built for command, not confession?
The young witness, Private Danny Martinez. Private Danny Martinez had been assigned to the camp only days before. At barely 21, he carried a camera loaned by a sister and a small pocket notebook where he documented what he saw. He believed that history could be honest if someone recorded it honestly, that the truth had to survive beyond rumor and rumor's slipperiness. Martinez moved quietly among the tents with a reporter's curiosity and a soldier's nervousness. He had not yet learned how words hardened into doctrine or how photographs could be used by more than one story. He would soon learn both lessons, but for now he only thought about capturing the moment, the light, the expression, the small gestures that reveal human truth. The medical team, Parker and Morrison. Lieutenant Samuel Parker had been a city doctor before the war, a surgeon in a Boston hospital whose life had contained medical journals, coffee at odd hours, and a steady, private devotion to saving tissue and breath. War had transformed him into a field surgeon who calculated casualties and ethical costs in a single heartbeat. Parker ran the medical tent for the detention compound. He triaged with the clinical decisiveness of someone who had to choose often and quickly. Dr. Helen Morrison was a Navy nurse whose steady competence had been honed in chaotic casualty wards. She had traveled from island to island, driving a protocol of pragmatic kindness.
Morrison carried with her a small store of Japanese phrases picked up from interpreters, phrases to soothe, to explain, to humanize. She found Yuki doubled over, heard the single syllable appendix, and felt the blood turn cold in her veins.
Diagnosis and the countdown. Parker's examination was fast and surgical. Palpation, guarding, rebound tenderness. The signs were classical. The clock began to tick. In the margins of the camp, there was no anesthesiology suite, no surgical light suspended from a rig, no backup blood bank. There were sutures, alcohol, an improvised scrub space, and a small set of instruments that had survived dozens of makeshift operations. They had perhaps 12 to 18 hours before the appendix perforated. Captain William Thompson, the camp commander, was a man who respected lines, regulations, and the literal letter of the Geneva Convention. He supervised supply distribution with bureaucratic care, food, water, shelter according to the documented minimums. He had been hardened by battle losses and preferred rules to improvisation. Yet on the line between law and life, Parker and Morrison saw a medical imperative, the duty to save a life, irrespective of nationality. But administration and medicine collide in scarcity. Who gets antibiotics when they are in short supply? Who receives surgery when the operating theater is a tent? Thompson authorized a provisional, strictly documented action, but with reservations. Everything had to be witnessed and recorded. Formal procedures would protect the men if the intervention were later questioned. Cultural barriers and the dress. The immediate practical obstacle was the kimono. Traditional Japanese dress is layered and bound with care. Its fastenings are cultural acts of modesty and identity. Asking a young woman to disrobe in front of a mixed group of male soldiers and prisoners would not only violate cultural norms, but also inflict further trauma. With only hours to act, the team could not indulge slow diplomatic persuasion. Parker made the blunt, urgent call. Access was needed now. The medical need overruled ceremony. Someone would have to cut away enough fabric to examine and operate. The order required a hand that could hold steady under a moral spotlight. Dr. Morrison stepped out to find Sergeant Crawford. The sergeant had a reputation for composure. He had been a farm boy turned Marine, the sort of man who could do unpleasant things without spectacle. When she explained the request, Crawford's stomach nodded, but he accepted the order. This was not a line he would cross lightly. It was the product of urgency.
Documentation, evidence, or accusation. Captain Thompson, wary of administrative backlash, insisted on a witness. Private Martinez was ordered to document. He swallowed, but raised his camera. Film, dates, notes. He would record every step, the exam, the tear, the stretcher, the operation. The documentation was both shield and truth. It could be used by investigators who sought to punish cruelty or by historians who sought to understand compassion in extremis. Martinez did not yet understand how a single photograph, out of context, could be transformed into an indictment. He only knew that truth lived in detail, the timestamps, the whispered translations, the sequence of scrubs and sutures. He recorded each moment with the naive faith that history deserved all sides of its story.
The tear and the tent. The sound of tearing cloth was absurdly loud in the cramped tent. Prisoners gasped. Some cried out in alarm. A corporal barked a control. Crawford placed steady hands on Yuki. She nodded through tears. Parker resumed the exam with full access. A rigid belly, a localized mass, the unmistakable sign that a surgical option was not an abstract luxury, but an imminent necessity. They moved quickly. The stretcher creaked under the weight of needs. Instruments were laid on a blanket, alcohol used sparingly. Parker scrubbed with the discipline of habit. Morrison prepared improvised drapes. The tent turned into an operating theater out of necessity. A lamp hung from a makeshift rig. The sound of practice breathing mixed with the scrape of scalpels and the hush of concentration. The surgery was an hour stretched into 3. Parker worked with a surgeon's concentration and a field surgeon's economy: cut, clamp, remove, irrigate, close. The appendix was inflamed and at the thin edge of rupture. They removed it cleanly, irrigated the peritoneal cavity, and closed the incision with careful stitches. Anesthesia was sparse. Yuki groaned as the limited sedative ebbed. When the final suture closed, a long-held breath escaped in the tent, like a small, private prayer.
Waiting, care, and small details. After surgery, the tent turned to recovery. Yuki's breathing slowed into sleep. Morrison watched, measuring breaths and counting pain signs. Crawford and Martinez stood outside the canvas flap, like two men who had witnessed something heavier than any debrief. Thompson recorded notes: inventory, signatures, justification. The administrative machine clattered even in the quiet of a life saved. Martinez developed the film in a spare tray later that day under a lantern. A sequence of images that in isolation would shock and confuse, but together told a fuller tale. He took extra notes: timestamps, spoken Japanese phrases, who had authorized what. This archive would, decades later, be the thread that rewove a single picture into truth.
Recovery and human threads. As Yuki recovered, small human threads formed. Morrison visited daily, bringing warm water, gentle words, and the careful patience nurses learn in crises. Their language was a bridge built of gestures, shared tasks, and the slow diplomacy of care. Yuki spoke haltingly, translated by the interpreter, about her work in field hospitals before capture, about bandaging wounds and washing the dead. She was trained to save life. She had almost lost her own. Yuki asked to meet the sergeant who had pulled the fabric aside. She wanted to say thank you. Crawford resisted the idea of praise and discomfort with being called a hero. He had only acted because someone needed help. But he met her in the small privacy of the recovery tent, with Morrison and an interpreter present. Yuki, hands still weak, clasped his in a gesture of gratitude that carried more than language could, a forgiveness folded from necessity and recognition.
The social aftermath in camp. Word of the event moved through the compound like a small rumor that changes shape as it passes hand to hand. Prisoners who had earlier recoiled at the tearing later learned the context and were surprised at the tenderness behind the violence. The story complicated networks of distrust and suspicion. It showed how actions that look brutal can, with full context, become saving gestures. The guards and other soldiers reacted in a spectrum, some skeptical, some proud, some resentful at the use of scarce resources on an enemy. Captain Thompson continued to record, an officer who would later admit the experience had unsettled his hardened, bureaucratized moral logic. He had defended rules as a way to order pain. That night he had seen rules bend under the weight of a single life.
Paper trails, locked files. Private Martinez's file was comprehensive. Photographs, interviews, timestamps, and the handwritten notes that documented the arc of the moment from diagnosis to discharge. He submitted the file to military intelligence as required. It went into a drawer lined with thousands of other reports, dossiers of conflict that were rational, sanitized, and destined to be sealed. Much of what the war produced is archived precisely so that it can be sorted into narratives. Some narratives, the human ones, become footnotes. Decades later, those files would be rediscovered. But in the immediate post-war years, they slotted into larger bureaucratic processes: debriefings, return orders, reassignments. The camp emptied, men went home, and the paperwork slept under the collective weight of demobilization.
Lives after war. Paths diverge and cross. After demobilization, the participants took different paths. Sergeant Crawford returned to Iowa and a life shaped by the work of soil and seasons.
He planted and harvested, married, and had children, yet the war's quiet corners lived in him as small scars. Lieutenant Parker resumed surgical practice in Boston, becoming a respected figure in medicine whose wartime choices shadowed his ethics. Dr. Helen Morrison continued medical service through NGOs, a career dedicated to cross-border humanitarian medicine. Yuki rebuilt differently. She trained, against the odds and the scarring of shame, completed medical education, and eventually became Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a physician in Tokyo specializing in emergency medicine. The scar on her abdomen was a living map, a reminder of a time when strangers had acted to preserve her life. But it also became a catalyst for compassion. She would spend a lifetime teaching trainees the ethics she had learned the hard way, that medicine is, first and always, a human duty. Private Martinez became Professor Martinez decades later, a journalist and an ethicist who understood the fragility of photographic truth and the power of context. He taught students how to read an image, to balance its aesthetic shock with documentary responsibility. He curated his own archive and sat often with the negative that had once been a small, dangerous object.
Rediscovery and the documentary. In the late 1970s, a historian pulling stacks in a national archive found Martinez's folder. The photos and notes caught her eye, not because they were unique in war, but because they bridged so many human themes: medical ethics, cross-cultural contact, the ambiguity of military necessity. She reached out to surviving participants. What followed was a reunion, a film, and a public awakening to a story that had been archived into silence. The documentary that followed did two things. It restored context to a single dramatic image, and it forced a public conversation about the moral choices made in wartime medicine. Viewers saw not a single explosive photograph, but a sequence: diagnosis, necessity, documentation, and care. The image's capacity to shock was reframed by careful narrative, showing how the tearing of cloth was not a spectacle of violence, but a desperate act of triage. Public reception and ethical lessons. When the film aired, reactions were mixed. Some viewers were scandalized until they knew the facts. Others wanted a neat hero-villain resolution that history rarely supplies. Universities picked up the case as a discussion point in medical ethics classes. When resources are scarce, how does one allocate care? What are the moral responsibilities of a military doctor? How does cultural difference complicate consent? The story became a small, vital case study. Parker's reasoning, Morrison's advocacy, Crawford's willingness to act, Martinez's documentation. Together, they formed a model for interdisciplinary moral action. The narrative was used to teach medics and soldiers alike that protocol is a tool, not an answer, and that humane practice requires courage in the face of institutional friction.
The crane, symbol, and continuity. Yuki's final gesture before release was quiet and full of significance. She folded a small origami crane from scrap paper and handed it to Morrison, a symbol in Japanese tradition of hope, healing, and wishes for a long life. The nurse kept it, later bequeathing it to Crawford's family. When Yuki and Crawford later attended memorials, that paper crane traveled across oceans like a fragile ambassador. The crane's path, from field tent to family altars, traced the intimate ways small objects carry meaning across nations and time.
Memorialization and museums. The photograph Martinez took is now preserved with careful captions at the Okinawa Peace Museum and in National Archives. Exhibits display not only the image, but also Martinez's notes, Parker's brief, and Morrison's interviews.
Curators insist on layered context, film, testimony, timelines, so visitors cannot extract a single frame as propaganda. Plaques and small memorials mark the former site of the camp. Among monuments to sacrifice is a modest plaque telling a story of an Iowa sergeant and a Japanese nurse whose lives crossed for a single afternoon under the 10th filtered light.
Questions that remain. The story's reopening raised difficult questions. How many others died in silence because resource allocation or prejudice prevented care? How do institutions balance command, cost, and compassion? What are the limits of consent in wartime when language and culture create barriers? This story provides no solutions, only a model of how individuals sometimes respond when rules and lives are in conflict.
Legacy, families, memory, and small acts. The families of those involved continued correspondence for decades. Crawford's children learned the hidden history of their father's silence. Yuki's descendants grew into careers in medicine with a consciousness that their mother's life had been saved by strangers. Private Martinez's students studied the archive and debated how to responsibly present images that shock without misleading. Parker taught his residents that surgical skill must coexist with moral imagination.
The origami crane, when finally placed in a museum case, sat beside a label that read, "A small paper object that traveled an ocean, honored a life," and reminded those who saw it that mercy is often simple in act but complex in consequence.
Closing reflection. What we decide in the dark. The torn dress can be read as a single violent act or as a quieter, harder story about the choice to save a life when systems fail. The difference between those readings depends on context, on the willingness of witnesses to record truth, and on the moral imagination of those who narrate the past. This story invites us to ask, in crises, who will be the ones to bend rules for life? Will we keep our hands clean by invoking regulation, or will we risk censure to save another person? The people in that tent in Okinawa chose the latter. Their choice did not make the war less violent or the world suddenly tender, but it did, in one small case, preserve a life that would go on to heal others. If you listen closely to the small archive, the photographs, the stitched notes, the origami crane, you hear not only the echo of a surgical tent, but also the continuing hum of a question. What will we do when duty asks us to choose between procedure and humanity?